would like to thank all the speakers, and on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank a very big thank you to all the panelists. I couldn't be more excited with the last part of our meeting today, giving the floor to George Strachan, who will have the will give us a bit of a summary about what we've heard today and his conclusions about the meeting. So, George, please, we're all looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'm happy to have this opportunity, but a little bit odd as well. You might have well have asked me to summarize the developments in biology since World War II. We've had a very rich discussion that have covered many areas. I can only mention a few highlights as opposed to a useful summary. Although I should point out that, that we co-chairs have suspected that this might happen and have done some early planning in having a follow-on paper, which would more carefully summarize the activities and the very rich discussion that was had today. So please look forward to the possibility that we will follow up by very general remarks with a more structured statement. Let me see. From a very general standpoint, from my perspective, we had a very nice arc in these presentations. Luciano gave us a very general framework. Then the next two areas focused in more on science as a specific example of the general data world we're heading toward. And then the final section, again, zoomed out to the big data world and the relationship between data and science. One of the other things that several speakers alluded to was the relationship of trying to do now for data what the internet did for networking. Let me remind you just briefly that already 50 years ago, the ARPANET had goals of providing access to computers, to data, and to people. How many of us 50 years ago would have been able to translate remote login, FTP, and email to today's environment of apps, web, wiki, and Amazon, and Facebook? The 50 years of development still is within that same architectural goal, but has developed phenomenally with the increased capability of the hardware and software and visionary people, often very visionary young people, I should point out. And if access to data was one of the original goals of the ARPANET, much of what we've been talking about here as data on steroids, information, and in particular knowledge, and how do we provide the additional structures. Digital object architecture was presented to the world by Bob Kahn as an addition to the internet to provide much more meaningful access to data. So in one sense, we're still staying within the original architecture of the internet. Luciano, now to make a few comments about the individual speakers, Luciano told us that he thinks that governance at this point in time is the most important aspect of going forward at the global level, that we're not just providing access to information, we're providing a new environment for humanity. This new environment for humanity will indeed require governance to be utilized in the fullest extent. He preferred the word agency to intelligence, which I think is a useful way to avoiding the discussion of what is artificial intelligence and what is not artificial intelligence. Certainly agency from a human or a machine standpoint is where we are heading. Life, of course, is online. The fourth revolution, as he describes in his book, is a crucial historical development. We've gotten considerably more complex in society, and his point that complexity requires coordination, and that it gets to governance and how we move forward. I was particularly moved by his change from read-write access, which is what we computerists have tended to think about, to read-write transfer, and not ignore, but understand the execution is embedded in everything. It's certainly true, by the way, that as he remarked in passing, that fair data objects, fair digital objects, puts much more stated emphasis on the reading and the transferring than on the writing. And of course, creating fair digital objects is a crucial pre-step, properly written with associated metadata and emphasis on public access to the links, etc., is a crucial development to be able to talk about fair digital objects. So I will now utilize, probably in my phraseologies, creating and utilizing FDOs, not just FDOs per se. Moving right along, of course, we had a very good discussion that Sabrina led, but hurrying along to Jürgen's point, he points out that climate change and digital change are two top of the agenda items for society right now, that we indeed, to use Luciano's phrase, we've entered hyperhistory as far as information goes. Well, we've entered hyperhistory as far as climate change goes too, since global warming is definitely upon us. And can we utilize the hyper change that's happening in the digital world to now help control and contain the negative hyper change that's happening in the climate? I think that's a very important top level issue. The 3 points that Jürgen emphasized: opening the links, not just the items, because the links are data as well, and perhaps the links are more important. The links provide the knowledge, the data provides the information. Open science, as we are attempting to move from 17th century open science to 21st century open science, where all science outputs are shared, will accomplish much of this. Jürgen also said we need to focus on the semantics. We've made some beginnings there with the semantic web and related applications. These are great steps forward, but initial steps, and moving on forward. I also like Luciano's comment in his Fourth Revolution book that humans are or have the only semantic engines at this point. Computers are syntactic engines, and at the moment we are concerned with finding ways to properly utilize those syntactic engines in support of our semantic engines. Whether computers will ever become semantic engines, I think, is a wonderful philosophical question that will concern us over the rest of this century. Jürgen's last point was we need public institution support. Make this a public-private partnership activity, not strictly a private center activity, which would put emphasis on narrow profits as opposed to broad societal profits. Deborah added many interesting comments as well. And then Beth took the stage and talked about technical aspects of what we are doing. And she specifically mentioned that we're trying to provide internet-like capabilities broadly for data. She mentioned 5 dimensions. The first was barriers. Well, I've always heard that if you want something to be accepted and used, you have to have low barriers to entry. A high barrier to entry system will remain an interesting curiosity, but will never become a wide public infrastructure. So I couldn't agree with her more that that's extremely important. And of course, her emphasis that the top tier should be data objects, let's say, as opposed to computer objects, which was the top tier in the internet itself. But now we need to change the top tier, make data the first class citizen, and continue our development in that fashion. Machine actionability, of course, is one of our fine goals. My own opinion is that machine actionability is a limited concept as long as humans are the only semantic engines. We can use computers in a semantic sense when it's procedural knowledge, such as language translation and folding of proteins, which we know how to produce knowledge from data in those cases of procedural knowledge. But for declarative knowledge, it still seems to require humans in the loop. Bindings and namespace management, also mentioned by Beth, and of course, bindings calls back to linkage and links again. Namespace management, how if we have a goal for a global situation, proper consideration of the global namespace is absolutely required. She looked over systems from TCP to Fair Digital Objects with a number in between, and gave us, again, emphasis on the need for low barriers for entry. She also mentioned, I thought, an interesting point about aggregation. Where are we aggregating? Are we aggregating at the digital object level, at the repository level, at the compendium of repositories? How do we do the aggregation to control complexity, but yet provide the right type of accessibility? I think that's still being worked out. Sarah re-emphasized many of these points with a focus on the researchers, which is where barriers to use is perhaps most important. If we can't provide a low barrier to use for scientists, providing these capabilities for science will be unsuccessful. Paolo talked about different data worlds, from the raw data to the published data and in between, and that policy frameworks is an important thing to be creating, be considering. And of course, our goal is to create value through open or fair data. And this undoubtedly will involve a public-private partnership, but we have to hope that it will be a shared ownership of the basic resources. I really like the concept that just because you host the data doesn't mean that you should own the data. Public ownership of the basic data seems to be a sine qua non in terms of the goals that we have. I agree that services that are developed on top of that basic data may well indeed be a costed item, but the basic data should be available for everybody to consider developing new approaches. I thought the analogy that Jean-Claude made of airspace, and nobody owns the airspace, but we do have governance rules, policy rules that talk about how people use the airspace. And I also like the idea of artistic, architecture includes the aesthetical dimensions. And indeed, artists need patrons of one sort or another, even if it's the patent agency, which allows you to put food on the table, or the research funding agencies or the universities that provide a broader context. Artists plus patrons plus science seem to go together. I agree that the big world is data societal, while our little corner of this is data, is science and science data. But again, that's like the internet, isn't it? The internet started out in service of science, developed by and in service of science, and then extended to global society and continues that extension. Seems to me that we are on a similar trail with data. I'm hoping that we will develop for science the capabilities that will then be found particularly useful by science, by society at large, and we will develop in that type of fashion. So let me add my thanks to the speakers and the responders and to the 200 people who joined us for this interesting discussion. And as I say, I hope you can look forward to our writing down these comments and summaries in a more detailed portion going forward. So those are my comments. Thanks. And Demetrius, I'll turn it back to you or Christine, whoever's taking it next.
Thank you. Christine?
Yes, I think that concludes a wonderful event. We will be posting the materials and videos shortly with the agreement of the speakers. Thanks everyone for all of your participation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.